Since about 2016, psychologists have finally, in their wisdom, determined that there is such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism. And so that would be a web of ideas that are correlated in that if you have one, you're likely to have the others. You can identify that set. I did some of the work on that, early work on that with one of my students, Christine Brophy. We found a set of progressive ideas and then a set of totalitarian leftist ideas that combined the progressive ethos with the willingness to use fear and compulsion and force to implement them. Okay, and so we found the following predictors because we were curious: does this system of ideas exist, or is it just a right-wing, conspiracy delusion? And the answer is there's clearly a set of coherent, statistically coherent left-wing ideas that are allied with the willingness to use compulsion and force. And we found 4 major predictors of the proclivity to have that idea set. And the first predictor, and it was a walloping predictor, negative 0.45, if I remember correctly, verbal intelligence and left-wing authoritarianism correlated more highly than verbal intelligence and academic performance, right? A stunning correlation. So when you ask yourself, how can people be daft enough to accept this relatively reductionistic and simple-minded view of the world, everything is about power? One of the answers to that is, well, they're not very verbally sophisticated. Okay. The second best predictor was being female. The third best predictor was having a feminine temperament, independent of being female, right? And the fourth best predictor was having ever taken even one explicitly politically correct higher education course. So now, since then, other people have developed analogous models of left-wing authoritarianism and looked for other predictors. And one of the most interesting predictors that has emerged is there's a very powerful relationship between the dark tetrad personality characteristics, including malignant narcissism, and the proclivity to hold left-wing authoritarian views. In fact, the correlation between malignant narcissism and left-wing authoritarianism is 0.6, which is so high that you could make the case, because the scales are somewhat unreliable, you could make the case that they're not distinguishable on the measurement front. Okay, I know this is a long-winded question, but I want to specify it exactly. All right, so the dark tetrad personality types, they show subclinical characteristics of psychopaths. And psychopaths are predatory parasites. And so we could imagine there's 2 forms of parasitism going on here. There's the Darwinian competition between idea sets for memorability and communicability, but then there's the proclivity for people who occupy the parasitical niche in the human ecosystem, and that would essentially be psychopaths, to utilize ideas like the parasitical idea sets that you described for their own truly parasitical purposes. And then I want to decorate that with one more thing. So you correct me if you're wrong here. I think this is actually, especially because of the emerging virtualization of the world, I actually think that there's an existential threat here, because parasitism is an unbelievably deep problem, right? Sex itself evolved to foil parasites. And there's always been parasitical people, criminals and the like, and the most parasitical of those are the psychopaths. And we've evolved mechanisms to keep the parasitical predators under control. A lot of them involve physical force. And all of our evolved mechanisms for dampening down the predatory parasites, none of them work online. And so I think our whole culture is enabling the predatory psychopaths on the criminal front and on the sub-criminal front, right? 35% of net traffic is pornographic. Online crime is rampant. And then you have all the demon troll types, who are polluting the political discourse, and there's data on them too. So if you're an online troll, you're much more likely to show all the dark tetrad traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and to top it all off, sadism. So please have at that set of ideas.
There's a lot of good stuff that you put in there, so I'll try to take a couple of threads. Number one, your first point about the battle between Darwinian ideas. There's actually a whole field called Evolutionary Epistemology that exactly speaks to what you're saying. That idea. So think back of Richard Dawkins when he introduced the concept of the meme in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene. So there was a whole field that unfortunately hasn't lived up to its promise called mimetic theory that exactly tries to model what you said, which is there's a bunch of ideas floating around, and what is the Darwinian mechanism that allows some ideas to be selected versus others that fail. Now, in my book, and then I'll come in a second to some of the predictors that you spoke about in terms of left-wing authoritarianism. In my book, I basically argue that what is common to all of these parasitic ideas is they wish to be free from the pesky shackles of reality, right? So postmodernism, as we've both commented on, is the ultimate granddaddy of all parasitic ideas because it basically frees us from, the pesky shackles of objective reality because it purports that there is no objective truth. Transgenderism frees me from the pesky reality of my genitalia. Social constructivism frees me from the idea that there might be innate biological differences between people. So it really stems originally from the noble notion of seeking to maximize empathy, right? So the idea starts off as a noble idea, but then it metamorphosizes into complete garbage in the pursuit of that empathy to the detriment of truth, right? So that's number one. Number two, regarding your predictors, I'm familiar with the study that you mentioned. I think it was a thesis that you supervised, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So we actually looked. So I'm actually working right now with a graduate student myself, where we're looking, and we've actually looked at the thesis that you supervised with your student. We're looking at another set of predictors that might interest you, Jordan, and specifically, we're looking at morphological predictors of ideological positions that people take. Now, that's uniquely interesting because you might otherwise not think that your morphology might be linked to the ideological positions that you take. But it turns out, and I discussed this in the Parasitic Mind, that, for example, your likelihood of supporting military interventionism is correlated to your upper body strength. Not surprisingly, so now I'm talking about male subjects. Male subjects who are stronger are more likely to support military interventionism. Stronger men are more likely to be against egalitarianism. I mean, enforced egalitarianism, right?
Yeah.
Taking from one. And so that to me is uniquely interesting because—
you can look at symmetry. So there's a paper.
Exactly.
I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a paper that was published 2 months ago, something like that, looking at, they used facial averaging of activist types on the left and then conservative types. You saw that. So the conservative—
Well, I was upset that I saw that paper because they're stealing some of our thunder. Now, you might remember in the Parasitic Mind, although I think I first proposed this theory to you in our first conversation when you came on my show. Remember, I talked about male social justice warriors as sneaky fuckers. That's an actual term, right?
Yeah.
Well, sneaky fuckers is actually not a term that I came up with to be profane. It's actually a zoological term that captures in nature the idea of kleptogamy, where you're trying to steal mating opportunities. So, for example, let's say you have a type of fish where there are two phenotypes of a male, There's the dominant, physically imposing male, and then there's a whole bunch of other males that actually pretend to be females so that they can sneak by the dominant males and then have a surreptitious coupling opportunity with the females. And that became known as the sneaky fucker mating strategy. And so in the Parasitic Mind, I argue that male social justice warriors are instantiating a form of sneaky fucker strategy, right? Look, I'm very sensitive. I hug trees. I cry when I watch Bridget Jones' Diary. See, I'm not, you don't have anything to be afraid of. And then hopefully that can allow me to have access to some willing and available females.
So do you know the literature on orangutans? So, there's two forms of male, there's two forms of male orangutan in any given what would you say, roughly tribal, local ecology. So there's One form of male develops, he's like the quarterback orangutan. He gets so big, he can't even really be arboreal. He has the huge fat pads around his face that make him round.
Right.
It makes his face round. And he's very physically powerful. And the females come to him to mate. But then there are other male orangutans in the same area that for a long time, anthropologists, primatologists thought were juveniles. But it turns out they're not juveniles. They're males who don't undergo the complete transformation into the non-arboreal male, and they use exactly the mating strategy that you described, right? So there's
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I was so. I'm always amazed that people get so triggered by your lobster analogy, because the whole field of comparative psychology operates on the premise that we could learn a lot about human cognition by studying our animal cousins. I mean, right? I mean, that's the whole premise behind the tree of life. So I don't really see why someone would be so triggered by the fact that you use the dominance hierarchies of lobsters to then make certain points about human society. There's a whole field called comparative psychology that does that. So to me, the people who are coming after you for those kinds of analogies between us and other animals are simply displaying their ignorance, right?
Yeah, well, they're mad at me because if lobsters have hierarchies, it's pretty hard to blame hierarchy on capitalism. Because we haven't discovered a subgenus of capitalist lobster yet, and it strikes me as highly unlikely that we will.